Hi, I'm Jared, and today I'll be reviewing Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's History of the Fall of Rome by Professor Douglas Boin. This book was published just last year in 2020 by W. W. Norton, and I read it, as you can tell, on the Kindle app. Now, with this book, Kindle and Amazon do a cool thing where you can read the ebook of it, but then also listen to the audiobook simultaneously so that you're seeing and hearing the text at the same time. I've done this with a few books previously, and I really like it as a feature. It's pretty much the only thing that keeps me buying Kindle books. I'm trying to move away from being so reliant on Amazon, but this feature is really kind of irresistible. So that's why I don't have a hard copy version of the book, but I urge you to go out and get a copy of Alaric the Goth because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it engaging, intriguing, and the approach that Professor Boin uses to craft this story and this historical narrative just makes for a really unique perspective on a fascinating period, that being the fall of Rome. So real quickly, Professor Boin is a professor of history at St. Louis University. One of his many degrees is from the University of Texas at Austin, of which I am also a graduate. So I have to give a shout out there to my fellow Longhorn, fellow UT alum, Professor Boin. So let's get into the book itself because there's a lot of really interesting stuff packed into it. So starting with the title, Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's Guide to the Fall of Rome. So when you think of a Goth or the word Gothic, what do you think of? Do you think maybe of a group of teenagers dressed in all black listening to The Cure or Cradle of Filth or some other kind of dark music? Do you think of an ornate, elaborate medieval cathedral with lots of gargoyles and flying buttresses and elaborate stained glass windows? Or do you think of sort of dark, romantic, stormy, emotional literature, perhaps of, English or German extraction from, the 18th or the 19th century, something like Frankenstein? All of those are valid answers. If your first thought was not to say, an ethnic tribal identity of people living in Eastern and Central Europe and interacting with the Roman Empire in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries and beyond, you would be forgiven, right? There's lots of other connotations that go along with the idea and the word Goth and Gothic. Now, if your association with that word, Goth, is of the antique version, the ethnic identity, you may also think of the Sack of Rome, an event that took place in the year 410 and which has spawned an entire kind of mythos of barbarism and of Gothic identity and of the fall of civilization. In the popular memory, the sack of Rome by the Goths, by an army led by a man named Alaric, is this symbol of decline and decay and epic destruction. Now, as you can tell, Boin's book focuses in large part on the lives and events and themes surrounding that event, the sack of Rome, but it does a lot to introduce a great deal of nuance into this period and to sort of shift the popular conception a little bit away from what we may think of just as an example of inhumanity or barbarism. And I'll read you a quote from the beginning of the book that I think gives you a good example of how we can connect these ideas of what it currently means to be a Goth or to be a barbarian with the actual historical reality of what happened back then. So he says, "Time has not looked kindly on what Alaric and the Goths wrought. From the medieval period to today, each new trend that departed in some way from society's norms has been stigmatized with the Gothic name. Haunting architecture, disturbing horror stories, and an intimidating black-letter typeface acquired the adjective from hostile critics. If being called Roman has always been considered traditional or classic, to be Gothic is to be different and usually a bit barbaric. As a historian, he says, I've always been fascinated by the origins of stereotypes and gross generalizations. Contrary to what the Romans believed, the Goths did succeed in making lasting contributions to world history. They established legal customs that shaped the histories of modern Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy. In their fight for human decency, they torched the bigotry that lay at the heart of antiquated notions of citizenship. And in an eerily prescient way, they championed the values of religious tolerance when many Christians at the time pursued heretics, imposed draconian moral laws on society, and outlawed the freedom of religious expression. So that paragraph really encapsulates some of the key themes and arguments that Boin is making in the book as he zooms in on this army, this tribe of Goths led by Alaric, explores their exploits in the years and decades leading up to 410 and then beyond, and uses that to make an argument about, how societies think of us versus them, how they build sort of inclusive, broad-based political power, and what the consequences of failing to do that are. These are issues and trends that have a lot of resonance with modern politics, with modern events, and that's something that I'll touch on a bit later on in the review. So, as you can tell from the title, Alaric is the main character of this book. He's the book's focus. But the issue with focusing an entire book on someone like Alaric is that we do not know much about Alaric as a person. Through various contemporary historians from the period, we can figure out where he was in certain times, what he was doing, where he grew up, some of these key biographical items, but it's very hard to paint anything like what we would consider a normal biography of a historical figure, because he left no writings behind. We don't know what he was saying or thinking at any given time. We have to sort of tease that out from context and from the broader political trends and events, and that's what Boin really excels at in this book. And it's a way of getting over this challenge of very thin, very scanty documentary evidence. So he does this by taking what we do know about Alaric's life and times, where he grew up, how he rose to prominence, the battles he engaged in, the people he interacted with, and filling in the gaps with context and inferences from the broader historical trends. This approach that Boin takes allows him to argue that the sack of Rome, as an event, was not simply a senseless, wanton act of violence and greed. It was instead the logical outcome of an ongoing series of negotiations and disagreements between a Gothic militia led by Alaric that had served the Roman Empire for several years and imperial officials who would not or could not give them the compensation or live up to the commitments that they had made to this army, and that the army, the Goths, felt that they deserved. It also enables Boin to make a broader argument, and a very compelling argument, in my view, that Alaric's actions and the actions of his Gothic compatriots may indeed have been motivated by repression, discrimination, disrespect that Gothic people had suffered at the hands of Roman imperial power for decades. So just to take a little bit of a step back, Rome is sacked in 410. If you zoom back, or if you rewind by about 35 years from that period to 376, that was the time when Gothic tribes, barbarian tribes, like the predecessors of Alaric, were first crossing the Danube River into what was then Roman territory. Over the course of the next 30 to 35 years, they fought, sort of by turn for and against Rome. They were discriminated against by Rome. They were compensated by Rome. It's a very sort of complex set of interactions that really colored the events that eventually took place in and outside and within Rome in roughly the summer of 410. In this way, the sack of Rome was a gesture of immense frustration, in effect saying, to Rome, if you will not willingly grant us the level of humanity and political power that we feel we deserve, we will humiliate you in the very heart of your empire. And that's exactly what Alaric and the Goths did. And like I said, these complaints that the Goths had were far from baseless. From 376, as soon as they entered Roman territory, some members of the Gothic community were subjected to horrible abuse by Roman authorities, including forcible family separations and child enslavement. So think about that. People striving for a better life, crossing a border, encountering an imperial power, and families are separated, children are separated from parents, communities are split apart. It has echoes with what we've seen over the past years and decades in our country and in our world. So after 376 and subsequent decades, Gothic armies fought on behalf of Roman emperors. Gothic communities suffered from instances of mob violence and mass murder at the hands of Romans themselves. And after a Gothic uprising was defeated violently in the eastern part of the Roman Emperor, Emperor Arcadius commemorated his domination of the Goths on a stone column erected in a place of great honor in Constantinople. So that it was even part of the visual symbolic language of the Roman Empire that the Romans were superior to the Goths, had dominated the Goths, effectively putting them in their place in the grand scheme of things in the Roman political world. So Alaric the Goth's story, as told by Boin in the book, resonates with our current political moment, as you can see. In the US and across the world, currently societies and people who hold political power are being asked tough questions about how and whether they will include, respect, protect, and support groups of others, whether those are immigrants or historically disadvantaged minorities or trans people or women. Alaric's story reminds us that we can and should judge political cultures and societies based on how they treat less powerful or people or those who are sort of considered outside the norm of political power. It also reminds us that when demands for inclusion and power sharing and respect go unheeded for long enough, violence and destruction can be the result. Now, just about a week ago in the United States, in Washington, D.C., a mob of disgruntled, upset, angry people, largely white people, stormed the Capitol building. They did so at the behest, at the incitement of a very powerful political leader and a set of political elites who were encouraging these people based on lies about the democratic process. Now, there were lots of historical analogies to be drawn around those events. One of the more potentially appealing ones is between the sack of the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, and the sack of Rome in the year 410 by the Gothic army. Now, both I and Professor Boin, the author of this book, feel that that is a poorly drawn analogy. There are not parallels between the sack of Rome and the sack of the Capitol in the way that at first glance you might think there would be. Now, the main reason for that gets to, it revolves around the reasons and the motivations behind the act of mass violence that the Goths committed and the acts that the mob rioters on January 6th committed. The Goths had years of discrimination, years of disenfranchisement, years of disrespect at the hands of the Roman political elites, those who were considered the in-group, they were considered the out-group. They had legitimate property and financial demands to make of the Roman Empire that had been granted to other groups. There were precedents for these claims. And in the political and power language of the 300s and the 400s, blockade, siege, and sack were considered, if not legitimate, at least within the boundaries of political norms. Meaning, if political leaders did not fulfill their obligations, they knew that force would meet them in one way or another. By contrast, those who assaulted the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th are part of the in-group. They're white people. Many of them are part of what we would call sort of an economically advantaged, a historically advantaged group. Since its founding, these people's ancestors have been part of what we would consider, the most enfranchised group in American society. What they are reacting to in committing this act of mob violence is not their historical disenfranchisement, but is instead the elevation and the respect that some members of contemporary American political culture have determined must be given to those who were historically disadvantaged, whether those are black folks, whether those are economically disadvantaged folks, whether those are gay people or women or trans people. The attack on the Capitol was a reaction against granting increasing power and privilege to those who were historical outgroups. Moreover, their entire attack, their entire motivation was based on lies and misrepresentations and a culture of alternate reality, right? That is a distinct difference from what we saw in 410 with the Sack of Rome. One thing that is somewhat similar, that's interesting, is that we have this conception of the Sack of Rome as this immensely destructive, scorched earth, brutal attack. And while to those who were living in Rome at the time, it probably was pretty frightening, there is evidence that suggests that it was more symbolic than anything. It was more an act of targeted and symbolic looting versus just wanton destruction. And that's actually an interesting parallel with the attack on the Capitol. Many of the people there were there for sort of the symbolic value of it, not necessarily the material political goals. There certainly were people there who wanted to capture, murder, overthrow, undertake these terrible actions, but there were plenty who were just there for the selfies, and there were plenty who were just there for the image of them standing in the rotunda or standing on the dais in the Senate chamber. So the power of political symbolism, especially in the context of struggle and in the context of jostling for power, there definitely are echoes between those two events. But if I had to throw in my lot with one group or the other, I would throw it in with the Goths of 410 and Alaric's army, not the rioters of the Capitol on January 6th. So that's, my overall take on the book. Again, really, really enjoyed it. Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's History of the Fall of Rome, covers a really fascinating period. And just overall, it's a good sort of breezy read for a book of history. I got through it very quickly, and it stuck with me. A lot of the lessons and a lot of the connections that Professor Boin draws in the book really resonated, and it's probably one that I will reread in the near future. So I highly recommend that you go pick up Alaric the Goth, and thank you for watching.